Hey folks, welcome back to Biology 12, Respiration Part 3. In this video we are going to look at gas exchange. And this video is going to be a little bit long. There is some technical information and there's actually a lot going on. So in this video, do your best to follow along. Feel free to pause and go back and watch things again. And please maybe jot down some questions you have while you watch this video and bring them to the next Zoom meeting or email me. You could ask me a question via email or ask me to do a separate little Zoom meeting with you. You are very likely going to have questions, and I would love to hear those questions and answer them for you. So, when we talk about gas exchange, we're going to talk about gases moving, oxygen moving, and CO2 moving. And you're going to, hopefully you can see that little animation. It's kind of weird. Actually, it's really weird. It's because of simple diffusion that the gases move. Remember, diffusion is just the natural movement of gas from a high concentration to a low concentration. So I want you to keep that in mind throughout this whole discussion, that when oxygen moves from one place to another, it's because it's going from where it's in high concentration to low concentration. And CO2 is doing the same. It will just want to move, and it will move from where there's lots to where there's not very much. External respiration. A couple of terms for you here. External respiration talks about gas exchange at your lungs. So it's the movement of gas from the alveoli. Remember in Mr. Waterman's video on structure and function, he talks about the alveoli being sort of the end of the line when air moves down into your lungs. So that's gas exchange at the alveoli into your blood. So that's between your lungs and your blood. You will see these terms throughout the presentation, and if you watch any other videos or do any reading on respiration, this PCO2, that means partial pressure of CO2. When we talk about diffusion, we talk about things going from high concentration to low concentration. Sometimes people will talk about going from high pressure to low pressure. So there's partial pressures of CO2, partial pressures of oxygen. In external respiration, if you think about this, this is at your lungs, your blood has brought CO2 from your cells to your lungs, and the whole point of breathing, remember, is to get rid of CO2. So the blood in the capillaries at your lungs has a really high concentration. I shouldn't say really high. It has a higher concentration of CO2 than your lungs do. That is going to cause CO2 to diffuse, to move from the blood into your lungs, because we want to be able to breathe that stuff out. So CO2, just by diffusion, is going to move on its own from high concentration to low concentration, or high pressure to low pressure. So it moves into your lungs, and then you're going to exhale it, and oxygen is then going to go the other way. You can imagine that when you inhale, there is a higher concentration of oxygen in your lungs than in your blood, because you've used up that oxygen for cellular respiration. So O2 is going to diffuse from your lungs into the blood. It goes the other way. So CO2 goes into the lungs, and O2 goes into the blood. And then it's going to hitch a ride on a molecule that you might know. It's called hemoglobin. It's going to go down. We're talking about O2. It's going to go down to your cells and get used in ATP production, cellular respiration at your mitochondria. So that's external respiration. That's what's happening between your lungs, your alveoli, and your blood. And there's a little picture that shows it. You can see with the numbers here that when you inhale, you've got 100% partial pressure of O2 in your lungs, but only 40 in your blood. So you've actually used up 60% of the oxygen for cellular respiration. So O2 is going to flood from 100 down to 40 just by diffusion. And CO2, you can see there's actually only a small concentration gradient, but it's enough to get it to move. There's 45 for a partial pressure of CO2 in your blood, and only 40 in your lungs. So the CO2 is going to move into your lungs, and then you exhale that. You breathe it out. The O2 that diffuses in your blood continues along this red arrow. It goes down to your cells and provides oxygen for cellular respiration. So external respiration is what's happening at your lungs. Internal respiration then is what's happening inside your body, further in. So now we're talking about, well, which way do things move at your cells? So we've carried that blood all the way into your body, maybe to like a muscle cell in your thigh. Which way is gas going to move? And I think you could probably predict this. For internal respiration, the cells have been sitting there. The mitochondria are cranking out ATP with cellular respiration. So they've made lots of CO2. Remember, that's a byproduct of cellular respiration. So the CO2 which is building up in your cells, and sometimes that can cause your muscle cells to burn. You can feel that if you're doing hard exercise. That CO2 is going to diffuse out of the cell into the blood. And then it gets carried all the way up to the lungs, it diffuses into the lungs, and you exhale it. So the CO2 is higher in your cells, so it diffuses into the blood, and O2 goes the other way. Your cells are low in O2 because they're using it up, but your blood has brought lots of it. It's brought this fresh supply, so the O2 is going to diffuse out of the blood into the cells and get used to create ATP. So here's a sort of blurry picture, but it works. You can see that the pressure of O2, it's actually dropped a little bit. It's gone from 100 to 95, but the cells only got about 40. So there's a big concentration gradient or pressure gradient. So the O2 is going to want to move into your cells for cellular respiration. And the CO2 has a concentration or pressure of 45 in your cells and only 40 in your blood. So it's going to diffuse into your blood, and then your blood's going to carry it to your lungs so that you can exhale it out. So keep that in mind. There are things you don't need to memorize the numbers, by the way. You just need to know where you have higher pressure and where you have lower pressures. That's all. So how do the gases travel between lungs and the cells and then and your blood? So how do we actually like transport things in your blood? And there's a very special molecule here, hemoglobin. And we'll first talk about how oxygen is carried, because carbon dioxide gets carried as well in a different way. So oxygen, when it moves into your blood, that's what we're talking about here, is how does it travel in your bloodstream. Some of it just dissolves in plasma. Plasma is just the liquid component of blood. It actually makes up most of your blood volume. So we're not talking about the actual red blood cells. It's just the liquid, and a small amount of it dissolves in there. But most of the oxygen is going to attach to a special molecule on a red blood cell called hemoglobin. And when oxygen attaches, hemoglobin becomes oxygenated because it's carrying this oxygen. It actually carries 4 oxygen molecules. So anytime oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, we change the name and we call it oxyhemoglobin. You guys maybe know that iron is important for blood, and that's because every little hemoglobin molecule has 4 irons. You can see them right here. There are 4 little iron molecules, and that's where the oxygen actually binds to. So every hemoglobin has, I like to call it 4 seats that oxygen can fill. It can carry 4 oxygen molecules at a time. There are, I believe the number is 250 million hemoglobin molecules per red blood cell. So I don't want you to think that a red blood cell only has one of these hemoglobins. There's like hundreds of millions of these hemoglobins per red blood cell. And each little hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So you're actually carrying a ridiculous amount of O2 in your blood at any given moment. So I want to talk a little bit more about how oxygen binds to those 4 little iron molecules on hemoglobin, because there's a little bit more to the story than it just diffuses in and attaches. So continuing this, we run into something called cooperative binding, and you're definitely going to be responsible for knowing this. I like to think of cooperative binding as like everybody jumping on the bandwagon. It turns out when one oxygen molecule binds or bonds onto one of those 4 irons on hemoglobin, it causes this conformational shape, this shift in the three-dimensional shape on hemoglobin. I'm just going to shorten hemoglobin to HB for you, just to make life easy. So it causes hemoglobin to shift in terms of its actual shape and structure from what we call the tense state, where it's all kind of bound up and the seats are hard to get access to a relaxed state. So you can imagine it's almost like a flower opening. So the first oxygen molecule somehow sneaks itself in there, and that causes the hemoglobin to sort of open up, to relax. And when it opens up, it exposes the other three iron molecules, and that makes it easier for oxygens to come and fill those seats. It increases the binding of oxygen. So I've put in brackets here, and I don't mean to be offensive, but it's kind of like the hoarding toilet paper during this COVID-19, where it's like one person does it, and then somebody else looks and goes, well, if they're hoarding toilet paper, maybe I should hoard it too. And everybody starts hoarding toilet paper, right? And you're like, what the heck is going on? That's just people being lemmings, right? They're just doing what other people are doing because they see it and they think they should do it. Oxygen kind of is doing the same, right? One molecule jumps on there, and the other oxygen molecules sort of go, oh, we're supposed to get on there too? And they all jump on to the hemoglobin. Just like how we all start buying toilet paper. Not all of us, but too many of us. So that's cooperative binding. One jumps on, and that causes a conformational change, a change in the shape of the hemoglobin, and then the other three seats will get filled. Keep in mind that I would guess almost 100% of the time, all four seats get filled. So there are those four little iron molecules within each hemoglobin, and they're always going to be fully saturated, unless you had like some issue where you were in a low oxygen environment or something. But you're going to fill all those seats only when the thing opens up, when that first one sneaks in and binds. Then everybody's on the bandwagon. Okay, so that was oxygen. Oxygen travels dissolved in plasma, and most of it bound to hemoglobin. Now, what about carbon dioxide? Because we have to get carbon dioxide to travel from your cells through your bloodstream all the way up to your lungs so that you can exhale it. So carbon dioxide also dissolves in the plasma, and that's pretty minimal, single-digit percent. Carbon dioxide also binds to hemoglobin. That's pretty minimal as well. When carbon dioxide bonds to hemoglobin, the name is called carbaminohemoglobin. And the little short form is HbCO2. Maybe I should have put in there, sorry to make you go back in your notes, all the way to here, oxyhemoglobin. Sometimes people will shorten that down to this, HbO2, which is like a hemoglobin with some oxygen bound to it. Oxyhemoglobin. And then when we're talking about carbaminohemoglobin, hemoglobin with CO2 attached to it, it's HbCO2. So it's kind of cool, we just list the gas that's attached to the hemoglobin. Now that's pretty minimal as well. That doesn't happen with a ton of it, probably single-digit percent again. The majority of carbon dioxide travels hidden as something called a bicarbonate ion. And the bicarbonate ion is this HCO3-. So your body, there's a special enzyme that converts CO2 into this form, HCO3-. That then just sort of dissolves in the blood, and that's a nice safe way to transport carbon dioxide. The chemical reaction that converts CO2 into the bicarbonate ion, you do need to know. And this is where I said this lesson was going to get a little bit tricky. There it is right there. Once you've written it down a few times, it's actually not that bad. I promise it's not. But you are responsible to know this. So what happens is if you need to get CO2 traveling through your bloodstream, CO2 bonds with water, and there's a special enzyme that would happen and work right there. That enzyme is called carbonic anhydrase. So you will need to know that term as well. So carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme sitting on red blood cells, converts CO2 into this form, which is carbonic acid, this H2CO3. Carbonic acid isn't very stable, and it almost immediately gets converted into HCO3, which is the bicarbonate ion. So that's how the majority of your CO2 travels, is actually being converted into that. But then it also converts into this H+. And I want you to think about that for a moment. Be a chemist for me. There's a bit of an issue with H+. H+ makes things acidic. So we have a bit of an issue here where when your body converts CO2 into HCO3, which it's doing right now, because that's how most CO2 gets converted before it moves into your bloodstream, the HCO3 is a safe, good way to convert and make the CO2 travel. But this H+ can make things acidic. And that's an issue. Because if your blood becomes acidic, that can cause some issues that we'll talk about later. So that H+ will also bind to hemoglobin. Binds to hemoglobin. And when it binds to hemoglobin, then it's not making your blood acidic. Because the blood pH levels in our body need to be pretty much the same all the time. It does not like really any fluctuation. So what ends up happening is that H+ binds to hemoglobin to make something called HHB. We actually put the H in front this time. And that sometimes people call reduced hemoglobin. So if you ever hear that term, reduced hemoglobin is hemoglobin that's carrying that H+. And that's a really good thing that hemoglobin can bind that H+, because it prevents our blood from becoming acidic. Again, acidic blood is a very, very bad thing for our body. So there's lots going on there. That's how carbon dioxide gets converted into a traveling form. And then when you get to your lungs and you want to exhale the CO2, that means we have to get the CO2 back into its regular gas form. So the reaction just goes the other way. And that's why we have these double-headed arrows. So at your cells, we're going this way. CO2 produced by your cells gets converted into HCO3 and H+. It travels in your bloodstream, back up to your lungs. And then when we get to your lungs, we want to exhale that stuff as CO2. So carbonic anhydrase, the same enzyme, simply makes the equation go the other way. We create CO2, and you breathe that out. So there's lots going on with that equation. We'll see that equation show up again. So CO2 and bicarbonate. So at your cells, let's talk about what's happening at your cells first. We know the cells are cranking out lots of CO2 because of cellular respiration. That's a byproduct. CO2 is going to enter your blood. But first, before it enters your blood, first the oxygen has to sort of jump off of the hemoglobin. So remember, the pressure of O2 is high in the blood and low in the cells. So O2 diffuses into the cells, leaving regular old hemoglobin. Sometimes we call it deoxyhemoglobin, but it's basically empty hemoglobin. That cooperative binding that we talked about a few minutes ago, that happens in reverse now. So when you get to your cells, you've got this hemoglobin with all 4 seats taken by O2 molecules, and the very first O2 molecule will jump off the seat or out of their seat and go into the cell. And then the other 3 sort of look at each other and go, oh, we should probably follow the bandwagon too. Let's buy more toilet paper. And as soon as one jumps off, the others follow. So there's cooperative binding in reverse as well. Everybody jumps off the bandwagon just as quickly as they jumped on. So O2 is going to jump into the cells off of the hemoglobin, which leaves the hemoglobin empty. We now have CO2 entering the blood. So I could almost add that in. CO2 enters the blood. Now remember, how does CO2 travel in the bloodstream? Well, some of it's going to simply just dissolve in plasma. Some of it will attach to hemoglobin, making carbaminohemoglobin, HbCO2, and then carbonic anhydrase is going to take the CO2 in your blood, and notice my double-headed arrows are only going in one direction now. Carbonic anhydrase is going to convert CO2 into H plus and HCO3. So the HCO3 just kind of dissolves in your bloodstream. That H plus is also going to join into your hemoglobin. Some of them will fill up their seats with H pluses. So I maybe should summarize. Oh, there it is. Well, you know what? I'm going to take that out. So what do we do? The CO2, again, just to, sorry about that. CO2 dissolves in plasma. Attached to hemoglobin to make HbCO2, carbaminohemoglobin. It dissolves as HCO3, as that bicarbonate ion. And then maybe I'll put it in a different color because this is not really talking about CO2, but the H plus joins with hemoglobin as well, because we want to not make our blood acidic. So there's also this other little reaction where we get that reduced hemoglobin, HHB, just so we don't make things too acidic. This is why, I should have mentioned it earlier too. Remember when I talked about the medulla oblongata and the peripheral chemoreceptors, the aortic arch and the carotid artery? Remember I said that they were measuring high CO2 levels and also high H plus levels? Hopefully now with this equation, you can see why we would measure H plus. Because it turns out most CO2 is actually hidden as a bicarbonate ion, which means your body, if it's monitoring CO2 levels, it might not actually see any CO2 because that CO2 is dissolved and been changed into this HCO3. It's kind of hiding in there, but there is H plus. So this H plus is really, really important for those chemoreceptors to monitor. So when we chatted about that in the second lesson, that's what the chemoreceptors are looking for, is that H plus. Because again, that's the form almost that CO2 is in. A lot of it's hiding in this bicarbonate ion, but there's this H plus. So your body's saying, well, you know what? If I can't find the CO2, I better look for something else that's there that's also dangerous too, and that's H plus. So that's what's happening at our cells. Let's see what's happening at your lungs then. So at your lungs, remember the whole point is we got to get rid of the CO2. The CO2 leaves the blood. So what's going to happen is first we have to get that bicarbonate ion back into regular old CO2. We have to unhide it. So that reaction that we looked at before, it simply goes in reverse. I almost should draw it the other way. So there's what it looks like spun around. I don't really like that. In fact, it probably should look like this, just to be consistent. H2 plus CO2, but now the arrow goes the other way. H2CO3, H plus HCO3 minus. So it actually should maybe show that. So now the reaction goes to the left, where the carbonic anhydrase, that's our enzyme that's doing this change for us. It's going to take that hidden form of the bicarbonate ion and convert it back into CO2. And then the CO2 and the water, actually, both of those get exhaled. And that water is why you can see your breath when it's cold outside. That's why it's steamy, right? You're not only exhaling CO2, but you're exhaling water as well. Oops. Spelling anhydrase. So that's how most of the CO2 is going to leave, and I'm just going to ink the rest by hand now because I don't quite like where my notes were going. What else is happening? Hopefully you can tell me. Well, the HHB, we have to release those H pluses and free up some hemoglobin. Because remember, we want oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin at your lungs. So that H plus is going to jump off, and that H plus is then going to get used right there. It's going to jump on board with the HCO3, and carbonic anhydrase converts it into CO2. We'll take that out so it's not messy. We also have some carbaminohemoglobin, some hemoglobin that was carrying CO2. That's going to separate and free up the hemoglobin for the oxygen. That's good. The CO2 gets exhaled. And then you also have, I won't even put it in there, but that very small amount of CO2 that was dissolved in your blood, it's going to just diffuse straight into the lungs. So that frees up our hemoglobin. All the CO2 is out. It gets exhaled, and that has freed up your hemoglobins. So now your O2 binds to hemoglobin to make oxyhemoglobin, HbO2. And remember, there's that whole cooperative binding thing. The very first O2 binds, and that sort of opens up the hemoglobin and makes it easier for the other three molecules to jump on board. So O2 binds to hemoglobin to make HbCO2, and a small amount of it dissolves in the plasma. And then off to the different cells in your body, all of that stuff goes. So again, busy, right? There's almost this picture, this video you need to see, and that's why you should go check out those other videos on the website. I'll show you those in a minute. So I'm going to stop there because I don't even know what we're at, but I bet you this is a long video. So there is actually a little bit more to this lesson, but I'm going to stop now and let you digest this. Let you catch your breath. I'm on a roll. So we'll split it. The next video that comes with this, which I guess is the fourth video, will be a really short one. So don't worry about it. So this is long. We'll take a break. I'm going to split this and make a fourth video. Try the gas exchange summary on the website. I will put an answer key on that very quickly. And let me just pull some of that stuff up for you. Okay, so the video on my website that would be really great to watch after you watch this video is this one right here. Hopefully you can see this respiration gas exchange. That is worth a few minutes of your time just to see somebody else go through all the same stuff. And then what I'd like you to try with this is Respiration 3 gas exchange summary. So this file right here. Give that a try. I will make an answer key. Hopefully you can go through and answer most of it, but I'll make an answer key and put that on here as well in the next day or two. And that way you can check if you're doing okay. Please don't just look at the answer key. Remember, I promise that's not going to help you. You need to sit down, try it out, maybe get yourself stuck, and then go look at the answers after. So you might need some clarification on this. In fact, you probably will want some clarification, and I think I'm going to do a little review of this whole process at our next Zoom meeting. So please join me on, when is our Zoom meeting going to be? Tuesday afternoon. Join me then, or Thursday morning, so that we can talk about this stuff and get it all cleared up in your brain. If you need some help before that, just fire me an email. Take care, folks. Have fun.